If Napoleon was often deceived, he also often used ruse to make his projects succeed, as is proved by the diplomatic military comedy that I am about to relate, in which I played my part. To understand this properly, which will give you the key to the intrigues that caused, the following year, the war between Napoleon and the King of Prussia, we must go back 2 months to the moment when the French troops, having left the shores of the ocean, were marching at forced pace toward the Danube. To go from Hanover to the upper Danube, the First Army Corps, commanded by Bernadotte, had no shorter way than to pass through Ansbach. This small territory belonged to Prussia, but as it was rather far from Prussia's own lands, from which it was separated by several third-rate principalities, it had always been considered, in former wars, as neutral ground, across which each side might pass, paying for what it took, and abstaining from any hostility. Matters being established on that footing, the Austrian and French armies had very often crossed the Margraviate of Ansbach, in the time of the Directory, without informing Prussia, and without that power taking it ill. Napoleon, taking advantage of this custom, therefore ordered Marshal Bernadotte to pass through Ansbach. He obeyed, but when the march of this French corps was learned, the Queen of Prussia and her court, who detested Napoleon, cried out that Prussian territory had just been violated, and took advantage of this to inflame the nation and loudly demand war. The King of Prussia and his minister, Monsieur de Haugwitz, alone resisted the general rush. It was in October 1805, at the moment when hostilities were about to break out between France and Austria, and when the Russian armies were coming to reinforce the latter. The Queen of Prussia and the young Prince Louis, the king's nephew, in order to induce him to make common cause with Russia and Austria, had Emperor Alexander invited to come to Berlin, in the hope that his presence would decide Frederick William. Alexander did indeed come to the Prussian capital on the 25th of October. He was received with enthusiasm by the Queen, Prince Louis, and the partisans of war against France. The King of Prussia himself, beset on all sides, allowed himself to be carried along, setting, however, as a condition, on the advice of the old Prince of Brunswick and Count de Haugwitz, that his army would not take the field until one had seen what turn the war on the Danube would take between the Austro-Russians and Napoleon. This incomplete adhesion did not satisfy Emperor Alexander, nor the Queen of Prussia, but they could obtain nothing more explicit for the moment. A melodramatic scene was played at Potsdam, where the King of Prussia and the Emperor of Russia, having gone down by torchlight beneath the sepulchral vaults of the palace, swore, in the presence of the court, an eternal friendship upon the tomb of Frederick the Great. This did not prevent Alexander, 18 months later, from accepting and incorporating into the Russian Empire one of the Prussian provinces which Napoleon gave him by the Treaty of Tilsit, and that in the presence of his unfortunate friend, Frederick William. The Emperor of Russia then went to Moravia to resume command of his armies, for Napoleon was advancing in great strides toward the Austrian capital, of which he soon took possession. On learning of the hesitation of the King of Prussia and the Treaty of Potsdam, Napoleon, eager to finish with the Russians before the Prussians declared themselves, moved to meet the former as far as Brno, where we now are. It has long been rightly said that ambassadors are privileged spies. The King of Prussia, who each day heard of new victories by Napoleon, wishing to know exactly how matters stood as to the relative positions of the belligerents, found it proper to send Monsieur de Haugwitz, his minister, to the French headquarters, so that he could judge matters for himself. Now, as a pretext was needed for this, he charged him to deliver the reply to a letter which Napoleon had addressed to him to complain of the treaty concluded at Potsdam between Prussia and Russia. Monsieur de Haugwitz arrived at Brno a few days before the Battle of Austerlitz, and would very much have liked to remain there until the result of the great battle that was in preparation, in order to advise his sovereign not to stir if we were victorious, and to attack us if we were beaten. Even if you are not soldiers, you can judge on the map the damage that a Prussian army, setting out from Breslau in Silesia, could have done by moving through Bohemia upon our rear toward Regensburg. As the Emperor knew that Monsieur de Haugwitz sent off a courier to Berlin every evening, he wanted it to be through him that Prussia would learn of the defeat and capture of Field Marshal Jellachic's army corps, which could not yet be known there, so rapidly were events then crowding upon one another. Here is how the emperor set about achieving this. The marshal of the palace, Duroc, after warning us of what we had to do, had all the Austrian flags which we had brought from Bregenz secretly put back into the lodging that Massey and I occupied. Then, a few hours later, when the emperor was talking in his study with Monsieur de Haugwitz, we repeated the ceremony of handing over the flags, exactly in the same manner as the first time. The emperor, on hearing music in the courtyard of his palace, feigned astonishment, stepped toward the windows, followed by the ambassador, and, seeing the trophies carried by the non-commissioned officers, called the aide-de-camp on duty and asked him what it was about. The aide-de-camp having replied that it was 2 aides-de-camp of Marshal Augereau coming to bring the emperor the flags of the Austrian corps of Jellachich, taken at Bregenz, we were brought in, and there, without a blink, and as if he had not already seen us, Napoleon received Marshal Augereau's letter, which had been resealed, and read it, although he had known its contents for 4 days. Then he questioned us, getting us to go into the greatest detail. Duroc had warned us that we must speak loudly, because the Prussian ambassador was a little hard of hearing. This fell very ill for my comrade Massey, the head of the mission, for a loss of voice scarcely allowed him to speak. It was therefore I who replied to the emperor, and, entering into his intent, I painted in the brightest colors the defeat of the Austrians, their dejection, and the enthusiasm of the French troops. Then, presenting the trophies one after another, I named all the enemy regiments to which they had belonged. I dwelt particularly on 2, because their capture was bound to make a greater impression on the Prussian ambassador. Here, I said, is the flag of the infantry regiment of His Majesty, the Emperor of Austria, and there is the standard of the Uhlans of Archduke Charles, his brother. Napoleon's eyes sparkled and seemed to say to me, "Very good, young man." At last he dismissed us, and as we went out, we heard him say to the ambassador, "You see, Count, my armies are triumphant on every point. The Austrian army is annihilated, and soon it will be the same with that of the Russians." Monsieur de Haugwitz seemed thunderstruck, and Duroc said to us, when we were out of the room, "This diplomat will write this evening to Berlin to inform his government of the destruction of Jellachich's corps. That will somewhat calm the minds inclined to make war upon us, and will give the King of Prussia new reasons to temporize. Now, that is what the Emperor ardently desires." The play thus performed, the Emperor, to get rid of a dangerous witness who could report on the positions of his army, hinted to the ambassador that it would be little safe for him to remain between 2 armies on the point of coming to blows, and urged him to go to Vienna, to Monsieur de Talleyrand, his Minister of Foreign Affairs, which Monsieur de Haugwitz did that very evening. The next day, the Emperor said not a word to us about the scene played the day before, but, wishing no doubt to show his satisfaction with the way we had understood his intention, he asked Commander Massey affectionately about his cold, and pinched my ear, which, on his part, was a caress. Meanwhile, the denouement of the great drama was approaching, and on both sides they were preparing to fight valiantly. Almost all military writers overload their narrative with so many details that they throw the reader's mind into confusion, so much so that in most of the works published on the wars of the Empire, I have absolutely understood nothing of the history of several battles in which I was present, and of which all the phases are nevertheless very well known to me. I think that, to preserve clarity in the account of an action of war, one must confine oneself to indicating the respective positions of the 2 armies before the engagement, and then recount only the principal and decisive facts of the combat. That is what I shall try to do, to give you an idea of the battle called Austerlitz, although it took place in front of the village of that name. But, as, on the eve of the action, the emperors of Austria and Russia had slept at the chateau of Austerlitz, from which Napoleon drove them, he wished to increase his triumph by giving its name to the battle fought the next day. You will see on the map that the Goldbach stream, which rises beyond the road from Olomouc, flows into the pond of Menitz. This stream, which runs along the bottom of a valley, whose approaches are rather steep, separated the 2 armies. The right of the Austro-Russians rested on a steep wood situated behind the post house of Austerlitz, beyond the road from Olomouc. Their center occupied Pratzen and the vast plateau of that name. Lastly, their left was near the ponds of Sachan and the marshes that surround them. Emperor Napoleon anchored his left on a hillock of very difficult access, which our soldiers from Egypt named the Santon, because it was topped by a small chapel whose roof had the shape of a minaret. The French center was near the pool of Kobelnitz. Finally, the right was at Telnitz. But the emperor had placed very few men at this point in order to draw the Russians onto the marshy ground where he had prepared their defeat, by having Marshal Davout's corps concealed at Gross-Ragon on the road to Vienna. On the 1st of December, the eve of the battle, Napoleon, having left Brno in the morning, spent the whole day examining the positions, and in the evening established his headquarters behind the center of the French army, at a point from which the eye took in the bivouacs of both sides, as well as the ground that was to serve them as a battlefield the next day. There was no other building at that place than a poor barn. The emperor's tables and maps were set up there, and he himself settled beside an immense fire in the midst of his numerous staff and his guard. Fortunately, there was no snow, and although it was very cold, I lay down on the ground and fell fast asleep. But we were soon obliged to remount to accompany the emperor on the visit he was going to make to his troops. There was no moon, and the darkness of the night was increased by a thick fog that made movement very difficult. The escorting chasseur beside the emperor thought to light torches made of fir wood and straw, which was of great use. The troops, seeing a group of horsemen thus illuminated coming toward them, easily recognized the imperial staff, and at once, as if by enchantment, one saw along an immense line all our bivouac fires illuminated by thousands of torches carried by the soldiers who, in their enthusiasm, greeted Napoleon with vivats all the more spirited as the next day was the anniversary of the emperor's coronation, a coincidence which seemed to them a good omen. The enemy must have been greatly astonished when, from the top of the neighboring hillside, they perceived, in the middle of the night, 60,000 lighted torches and heard the cries, repeated 1,000 times over, "Vive l'Empereur," mixed with the sound of the numerous bands of the French regiments. Everything was joy, light, and movement in our bivouacs, while on the Austro-Russian side, all was dark and silent. The next day, the 2nd of December, the cannon was heard at daybreak. We have seen that the emperor had shown few troops on his right. It was a trap he was setting for the enemies, so that they might be able to take Telnitz easily, cross there the Goldbach stream, and then go to Gross-Ragon to seize the road from Brno to Vienna, thus cutting us off from any means of retreat. The Austro-Russians fell headlong into the snare, for, denuding the rest of their line, they clumsily piled considerable forces into the low ground of Telnitz, as well as into the marshy defiles that border the ponds of Sachan and Menitz. But as they imagined, one knows not why, that Napoleon intended to withdraw without accepting battle, they resolved, to render the success more complete, to attack us, near the Santon, on our left, as well as on our center, before Puntowitz, so that our defeat would be complete when, forced to fall back at those 2 points, we should find behind us the road from Brno to Vienna occupied by the Russians. But on our left, Marshal Lannes not only repulsed all the enemy attacks against the Santon, he drove them to the other side of the road from Olomouc, as far as Blasiowitz, where the ground, becoming more level, allowed Murat's cavalry to execute several brilliant charges, the result of which was immense, for the Russians were driven, drums beating, as far as the village of Austerlitz. While our left was winning this shining success, the center, formed by the troops of Marshals Soult and Bernadotte, placed by the emperor at the bottom of the Goldbach ravine, where it was hidden by a thick fog, dashed toward the ridge upon which stands the village of Pratzen. It was at this moment that there appeared, in all its brilliance, that radiant sun of Austerlitz, of which Napoleon so loved to recall the memory. Marshal Soult carried not only the village of Pratzen, but also the immense plateau of that name, which was the highest point of the whole region, and therefore the key of the battlefield. There a most violent combat was engaged, under the emperor's eyes, in which the Russians were beaten. But a battalion of the 4th of the line, of which Prince Joseph, Napoleon's brother, was colonel, allowing itself to be carried too far in the pursuit of the enemy, was charged and broken by the Chevalier Guards and the cuirassiers of Grand Duke Constantine, Alexander's brother, who took from it its eagle. Numerous lines of Russian cavalry advanced rapidly to support the momentary success of the Chevalier Guards, but Napoleon, having launched against them the Mamelukes, the chasseurs à cheval, and the grenadiers à cheval of his guard, led by Marshal Bessières and General Rapp, there was one of the bloodiest melee. The Russian squadrons were broken and thrown back beyond the village of Austerlitz, with immense loss. Our horsemen captured many standards and prisoners, among whom was Prince Repnin, commander of the Chevalier Guards. This regiment, composed of the brightest youth of the Russian nobility, lost many men because the braggadocio of the Chevalier Guards against the French being known to our soldiers, the latter, especially the grenadiers à cheval, set upon them furiously, and, as they passed their enormous sabres through their bodies, shouted, "Let us make the ladies of St. Petersburg weep." The painter Gérard, in his picture of the Battle of Austerlitz, chose as his subject the moment when General Rapp, coming out of the fight, wounded, all covered with the blood of foes and his own, presents to the Emperor the flags that have just been taken, as well as Prince Repnin, made prisoner. I was present at that impressive scene, which the painter reproduced with remarkable exactness. All the heads are portraits, even that of the brave chasseur à cheval, who, without complaint, although his body was pierced by a bullet, had the courage to come as far as the Emperor and fell stone dead, while presenting to him the standard that he had just taken. Napoleon, wishing to honor the memory of this chasseur, instructed the painter to place him in the composition. One also notices in this picture a Mameluke who, carrying in one hand an enemy flag, holds in the other the bridle of his dying horse. This man, named Mustafa, known in the guard for his courage and his ferocity, had, during the charge, set off in pursuit of Grand Duke Constantine, who got rid of him only by firing a pistol shot that grievously wounded the Mameluke's horse. Mustafa, grieved to have only a standard to offer the Emperor, said in his jargon, as he presented it, "Ah, if me catch Prince Constantine, me cut head, and me bring to the Emperor." Napoleon, indignant, replied, "Will you be silent, you vile savage?" But let us finish the account of the battle. While Marshals Lannes, Soult, and Murat, and the Imperial Guard were beating the center and the right of the Austro-Russians and driving them beyond the village of Austerlitz, the enemy left, falling into the trap Napoleon had set for them, and seeming to hold the environs of the ponds, flung itself upon the village of Telnitz, seized it, and, crossing the Goldbach, was preparing to occupy the road to Vienna. But the enemy had ill-judged Napoleon's genius in supposing him capable of committing so great a fault as leaving undefended a road that ensured his retreat in case of misfortune, for our right was guarded by Marshal Davout's divisions, hidden behind, in the village of Gross-Raygon. From that point, Marshal Davout swooped upon the Austro-Russians as soon as he saw their masses entangled in the defiles between the ponds of Telnitz, Menitz, and the stream. The Emperor, whom we left on the Pratzen plateau, rid of the enemy right and center, which were fleeing behind Austerlitz, then descended from the heights of Pratzen with Soult's corps and all his guard, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and rushed toward Telnitz, where he took the enemy columns in rear, while Marshal Davout attacked them in front. From that moment, the numerous, heavy Austro-Russian masses, crowded on the narrow causeways that run along the Goldbach stream, finding themselves taken between two fires, fell into inexpressible confusion. The ranks mingled, and each sought his safety in flight. Some threw themselves pell-mell into the marshes that border the ponds, but our infantry followed them there. Others hoped to escape by the path that separates the two ponds. Our cavalry charged them and made a frightful slaughter. Finally, the greater number of the enemy, chiefly the Russians, tried to pass over the ice of the ponds. It was very thick, and already 5,000 or 6,000 men, keeping a little order, had reached the middle of Lake Sachan, when Napoleon, calling up the artillery of his guard, ordered fire with round shot upon the ice. It broke in a multitude of places, and a huge cracking was heard. The water, penetrating through the fissures, soon rose over the floes, and we saw thousands of Russians, as well as their numerous horses, guns and wagons, slowly sink into the abyss. A horribly majestic spectacle that I shall never forget. In an instant, the surface of the pond was covered with everything that could, and knew how to, swim. Men and horses struggled amid the ice and the waters. Some, in very small number, managed to save themselves with the help of poles and ropes that our soldiers held out to them from the bank, but the greater part drowned. The number of combatants that the emperor had at his disposal in this battle was 68,000 men. That of the Austro-Russians rose to 92,000. Our loss in killed or wounded was about 8,000 men. The enemy admitted that theirs, in killed, wounded, or drowned, came to 14,000. We had taken 18,000 prisoners, 150 guns, as well as a great number of standards and flags. After ordering the enemy to be pursued in every direction, the emperor went to his new headquarters, established at the post house of Austerlitz on the road to Olomouc. He was radiant, as is easy to understand, although he several times expressed the regret that the only eagle we had lost belonged to the fourth of the line, of which Prince Joseph, his brother, was colonel, and that it had been taken by the regiment of Grand Duke Constantine, the Emperor of Russia's brother. That was, in effect, rather piquant, and made the loss more keenly felt. But Napoleon soon received great consolation. Prince Johann von Liechtenstein came, on behalf of the Emperor of Austria, to ask him for an interview, and Napoleon, understanding that this must bring peace and deliver him from the fear of seeing the Prussians march upon his rear before he was rid of his present enemies, consented. Of all the corps of the French Imperial Guard, the regiment of chasseurs à cheval was the one that had suffered the greatest losses in the great charge carried out on the Pratzen Plateau against the Russian guards. My poor friend Captain Fournier had been killed, and General Morland as well. The Emperor, always attentive to whatever could stir emulation among the troops, decided that General Morland's body would be placed in a monument that he proposed to have raised in the center of the Esplanade of the Invalides, in Paris. The doctors, having neither the time nor the necessary ingredients on the battlefield to embalm the general's body, shut it in a barrel of rum, which was transported to Paris, but the events that followed having delayed the construction of the monument destined for General Morland, the barrel in which he had been placed was still in one of the rooms of the School of Medicine when Napoleon lost the empire in 1814. Shortly after, the barrel having burst from age, there was great astonishment to see that the rum had made the general's moustaches grow so extraordinarily that they fell below his belt. The body was perfectly preserved, but the family was obliged to bring a lawsuit to obtain its restitution from a scholar who had made it an object of curiosity. So, love glory, and go to get yourselves killed so that some crack-brained naturalist may then place you in his library between a rhinoceros horn and a stuffed crocodile. At the Battle of Austerlitz, I received no wound, although I was often much exposed, notably during the melee of the cavalry of the Russian Guard on the Pratzen Plateau. The Emperor had sent me to carry orders to General Rapp, whom I managed with great difficulty to reach in the midst of that frightful jumble of men cutting one another's throats. My horse struck against that of a Chevalier Guard, and our sabres were about to cross when we were separated by the fighters. I got off with a heavy bruise. But the next day I ran a much greater danger, and of a kind quite different from those one ordinarily meets on the battlefield. Here is the occasion. On the morning of the 3rd, the Emperor mounted and went over the various positions that had witnessed the previous day's combats. Having reached the banks of the Satchen Pond, Napoleon, having dismounted, was talking with several marshals around a bivouac fire when he caught sight, floating, 100 paces from the causeway, of a fairly large isolated floe, upon which lay a poor decorated Russian non-commissioned officer who could not help himself because a bullet had passed through his thigh. The blood of this unfortunate had stained the floe that supported him. It was horrible. This man, seeing a very numerous staff surrounded by guards, thought that Napoleon must be there. He therefore raised himself as he could, and cried that warriors of all countries become brothers after the fight, and he asked life of the powerful emperor of the French. Napoleon's interpreter having translated this plea to him, the emperor was moved and ordered General Bertrand, his aide-de-camp, to do all he could to save this unfortunate. At once, several men of the escort, and even 2 staff officers, seeing on the shore 2 big tree trunks, pushed them into the pond, and then, perching themselves astride them, fully dressed, they hoped, by moving their legs together, to make those pieces of wood advance. But scarcely were they a fathom from the bank when the trunks rolled over, which threw into the water the men who were riding them. In an instant their clothes were soaked, and as it was freezing hard, the cloth of the swimmers' sleeves and trousers stiffened, and their limbs, caught as if in cases, could not move. Thus several nearly drowned, and only with great difficulty, aided by the ropes that were thrown to them, did they manage to regain the shore. I then chanced to say that the swimmers ought to have stripped quite naked. First, to keep the freedom of their movements, and second, so as not to be exposed to passing the night in wet clothes. General Bertrand, having heard this, repeated it to the emperor, who declared that I was right, and that the others had shown zeal without discernment. I do not wish to make myself better than I am. I shall therefore confess that, having just witnessed a battle where I had seen thousands of dead and dying, my sensibility being blunted, I no longer found in myself philanthropy enough to risk catching a chest inflammation by going to wrest from the ice the life of an enemy whose sad fate I confined myself to deploring. But the emperor's remark, pricking my pride, made it seem ridiculous for me to have given advice that I would not dare to put into execution. So I jumped down from my horse, stripped stark naked, and plunged into the pond. I had run a great deal during the day and had been hot. The cold seized me violently. But young, vigorous, a very good swimmer, and encouraged by the emperor's presence, I made for the Russian non-commissioned officer, when my example, and probably the praise that the emperor was giving me, determined the lieutenant of artillery, named Rumestein, to imitate me. While he was undressing, I continued forward, but I encountered much more difficulty than I had foreseen, for, as a result of the catastrophe that had taken place the day before on the pond, the old, thick ice had almost entirely disappeared, but a new layer had formed, of the thickness of a few lines, the rather sharp roughness of which scratched the skin of my arms, chest, and neck in a very unpleasant way. The artillery officer, who had joined me halfway, had not noticed this, because he had profited from the sort of path I had traced in the new ice. He had the fairness to point this out to me, asking to take his turn to go ahead, which I accepted, for I was being cruelly torn. We at last reached the old, enormous floe upon which lay the unfortunate Russian non-commissioned officer, and we thought we had accomplished the most painful part of our undertaking. We were greatly mistaken, for as soon as, by pushing the floe, we made it move, the layer of new ice which covered the surface of the water, being broken by its contact, piled up in front of the big floe, so that a mass soon formed which not only resisted our efforts, but split the sides of the big floe, whose volume diminished at every moment, and made us fear seeing engulf the unfortunate man we wished to save. The edges of this big floe were, moreover, very sharp, which forced us to choose the spots on which we pressed our hands and our chests while pushing. We were exhausted. Finally, to crown our misfortune, on approaching the shore, the ice split at several points, and the part on which the Russian lay presented nothing but a slab a few feet wide, incapable of supporting that poor devil who was about to sink, when my comrade and I, feeling at last that we had footing on the bottom of the pond, passed our shoulders under the slab of ice and carried it to the bank, from which ropes were thrown to us that we tied around the Russian, and he was at last hauled up onto the bank. We too got out of the water by the same means, for we could scarcely stand, so harassed torn, bruised, and bleeding were we. My good comrade Massy, who had followed me with the greatest anxiety throughout the crossing, had thought to have his horse blanket placed in front of the bivouac fire, and he wrapped me in it as soon as I was on the bank. After drying myself well, I dressed and wanted to stretch out before the fire, but Dr. Larry opposed this and ordered me to walk, which I could do only with the help of 2 chasseurs. The Emperor came to congratulate the artillery lieutenant and me on the courage with which we had undertaken and carried out the rescue of the wounded Russian, and, calling his Mameluke Rustan, whose horse always carried provisions, he had excellent rum poured for us, and asked us, laughing, how we had found the bath. As for the Russian non-commissioned officer, the Emperor, after having him dressed by Dr. Larry, had several gold pieces given to him. He was fed, covered with dry clothes, and, after being wrapped in good warm blankets, was laid in one of the houses of Telnitz that served as an ambulance. Then, the next day, he was transported to the hospital at Brno. This poor fellow blessed the Emperor, as well as Monsieur Rumestin and me, whose hand he wished to kiss. He was a Lithuanian, that is to say, born in a province of Old Poland annexed to Russia. Thus, as soon as he had recovered, he declared that he wished to serve only Emperor Napoleon henceforth. He therefore joined our wounded when they returned to France and was incorporated into the Polish Legion. Finally, he became a non-commissioned officer in the Lancers of the Guard, and every time I met him, he expressed his gratitude to me in a very expressive jargon. The icy bath that I had taken, and the truly superhuman efforts that I had been obliged to make to save that unfortunate, might have cost me dear if I had been less young and less vigorous, for Monsieur Rumsten, who did not possess the latter advantage in the same degree, was seized that very evening by one of the most violent chest inflammations. He had to be transported to the hospital at Brno, where he spent several months between life and death. He never completely recovered, and his sickly state made him leave the service a few years later. As for me, although very weakened, I had myself hoisted into the saddle as soon as the Emperor moved away from the pond to make for the chateau of Austerlitz, where his headquarters had just been established. Napoleon never went except at the gallop. Broken as I was, that pace suited me little. I followed, however, because, night approaching, I feared to stray from the battlefield, and, besides, going at a walk, the cold would have seized me. When I arrived in the courtyard of the chateau of Austerlitz, several men were needed to help me dismount. A general shiver seized my whole body. My teeth chattered. I was very ill. Colonel Dahlmann, major of the chasseurs à cheval of the guard, who had just been named general in replacement of Morland, no doubt recognizing the service that I had rendered the latter, led me into one of the barns of the chateau, where he had established himself with his officers. There, after having me take very hot tea, his surgeon rubbed my whole body with warm oil. I was swaddled in several blankets, and they slipped me into a huge heap of hay, leaving only my face outside. A gentle warmth, little by little, penetrated my benumbed limbs. I slept very well, and thanks to this good care, as well as to my 23 years, I found myself the next morning fresh, in good spirits, and able to mount to witness a spectacle of very high interest. That concludes the 20th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.